We welcome you to HAI at Work. Today's topic is managing risk in hazardous environments. We have an exceptional panel today. I think we're going to have a really good time with this one. I think it's going to be incredibly informative. I'd like to introduce our speakers today. We will start with Jim Viola, the President and CEO of HAI. Today's question moderator is Chris Hill, our Director of Safety. Our first speaker today is Commander James Cooley, who currently serves as the Aviation Safety Training Manager for the Coast Guard's Office of Safety and Environmental Health in Washington, D.C. We have Captain Christopher Hulser, who is the Commanding Officer of Coast Guard Aviation Training Center in Mobile, Alabama. And we have Captain Mike Campbell, who is the Chief of Response for U.S. Coast Guard 11th District in Alameda, California. We do encourage you to ask questions today. To ask questions, there is a module on the side of your control panel on the side of your computer screen. Please type your question in and we will do our best to respond to as many questions as possible before we run out of time today. There will be a video that's going to be available tomorrow. It usually takes at least 24 hours for the video to render and get posted. In case you miss anything or want to go back and review it, or in case you want to share it with anybody. There are also two handouts today. They include the presentations from two of the panelists, and so feel free to download those. Those are in the handout module, also in the control panel for you. And now I'd like to introduce Jim Viola, the President and CEO of HAI.
All right, well, thanks. We'll get things started. Yeah, I think we had over 200 people sign up again today, so I certainly appreciate everyone that was interested here. In a perfect world, every pilot flies with clear visibility and more than enough fuel, and a helicopter normally that performs optimally. Well, in reality, weather and other factors add elements of risk to every flight. I think most pilots understand how to mitigate risks and certainly try to learn how to mitigate risk in everyday flight, and certainly something that we teach as flight instructors. But what about the pilots that encounter a flight that they know is going to be into present uncommon hazards, which is what these guys do today. Today's panelists are experts in managing risk in a hazardous environment. For the U.S. Coast Guard, even a routine patrol flight can quickly turn into a rescue mission that poses unavoidable risk. Many of you have been aware that a hurricane is approaching right now in the Gulf in the southern United States. And I know one of our panelists, Chris, can tell you about what's being done down there right now and get the latest update on the storm. So while most people are moving to safer areas, the Coast Guard, when these events are happening, are preparing to rescue the people that get stuck riding out the storm. This means flight into weather with high winds, heavy rains, and airborne debris. It means flying at low altitudes where there are also trees, towers, wires to worry about. And so they manage their risk to perform these missions safely. So let's get started, and allow me to introduce Commander Jim Cooley, as Dan said, from the Aviation Safety Manager for the U.S. Coast Guard Office of Safety and Environmental Health. And I understand he lives in Delray, right, probably down around the corner from me. So we'll have to share an adult beverage one of these nights. Thanks. Take it away, Jim.
I'm looking forward to that. Okay, well, hey, thank you so much for having me. Again, my name is Commander Jim Cooley. When we can already roll to the next slide, I'll start off by saying when I was 17 years old, transitioning from sports and music to education, to education rather, I joined the Coast Guard because I latched onto the 24/7 humanitarian missions. Then I wanted to get into rotary wing aviation in order to be right there, actually saving people. Then getting into aviation safety, where I've been since 2014, feels to me like I'm helping save the lifesavers. So that's why I'm here and why I care about this topic. Now, this picture was the third most challenging rescue I've accomplished. Oil rig Kulik was getting towed past Kodiak Island, Alaska in 2012. There was a low pressure system that made for some just horrendous weather. The tow line broke between the towing vessel and the oil rig. The spare tow line broke. Then the other towing vessel's tow line broke, allowing the oil rig to start just drifting toward the rocks. And with an impending collision, the 18 people on board needed to be pulled off. A challenging task because the oil rig was bobbed around like a wine cork in a wave pool. The mass, the mast right there in that picture, and a loose cable were whipping around with every heave. So how do we get from this chaotic scene to 18 people being saved? We own as much as we can is how. What do I mean by that? Well, we probably don't own the aircraft we fly. We don't own ICAO regulations or FARs, FARs. We don't own procedures and policies, et cetera, but you do own your life. Next slide, please. So this is my own pre-flight checklist. You may be wondering, the Coast Guard doesn't publish checklists. This guy has to make his own handwritten checklist. What's up with that? Not to worry, the Coast Guard does furnish checklists, and they're great. But by making my own, I can cover the required items, plus all the pitfalls or items that are important to me. For instance, the Coast Guard requires that we talk about the flight plan, item 4. But the Coast Guard does not require I know how recent it was that the other pilot I'm flying with last performed the mission we are about to go do. I would like to explicitly know that. The Coast Guard requires that we discuss weather, but does not require that we cover exactly what we're going to do if we inadvertently go IMC, given the weather and topography of where we're about to go fly. After 7 years of standing duty, I finally realized that I could do a lot of my thinking ahead of time. And as a handout, one of the handouts, you have a checklist that I use to brief the aircrew I was about to stand duty with for the next 24 hours. Just like when we're flying on a dark and stormy night, we rely on procedures written in well-lit, comfortable rooms at modest times of day. Similar to this, by thinking through typical scenarios and putting them down on paper, I can have everyone in the aircrew be in lockstep at the beginning of the duty period, and long before we are woken up at 3 a.m., race into the helicopter and having to think, decide, and direct people on things like radio frequencies, fuel loads, and flight planning, all while adrenaline is hijacking our minds. So in flight training, we learned about chair flying, visualizing and going through flight procedures while just sitting in the chair. This principle holds true for decisions. What one decision can you make today to address the reoccurring decisions that surface every flight or many flights? Next slide, please. Okay, I just had to arrange my windows there. So this principle has saved my life and may save yours. We own our training. This picture is of a ridgeline in the foothills of the Oregon Cascades. Both sides of this ridge drop off, making this approach rather uncomfortable when you're coming in for landing. But that's the point. Expanding one's envelope of comfort, but within the scope of control and procedures, can prove fruitful when we need it most. And so a lot of military flight time can be used to do training flights because of the unique mission sets and available resources. But most of this audience probably can't dedicate 50% of their hours to training. So what can you do? You can make every hour, every transition point in a flight count. In your handout, there's the things to do during a random trainer. A lot of it may be foreign, be it Coast Guard jargon or 860 jargon, but the point is not to give you a list of things you should do in your training, but instead just show you something I have found useful in planning flights. This breeds the ability to stay nimble. As pilots, we leave in checklists, and as such, we can leave the thinking on the page and focus on our environment. That's all well and good, but that said, staying deft at all the capabilities, not just the ones you use all the time, or the ones that you're most familiar with, it may just save the day sometime. So maybe this means stealing an instrument approach at the end of a flight, or doing a kind of pedestrian maneuver, but with degraded flight stabilization, or grabbing a couple bounces in the pattern. Not only does this make a flight more dynamic and fun, you may just need those skills at the ready. Next slide, please. Which speaks to personal limitations. I would argue that personal limitations are more important than aircraft or procedural limitations. One day, on a duty training flight, we practiced hovering at 12,000 feet. We went through the motions of calculating the power required to do such a hover and juxtapose that with the power the helicopter had available. Then, in the middle of the sky, not near anything, we practiced what would happen if we had a loss of lift, be it from wind shift imposed on the tail, or graphic turbulence, or engine degradation, and just performed a flyaway. Nothing cosmic, nothing cosmic. But for an organization who spends most of our time operating near sea level, through the nature of being in the Coast Guard, with all that dense air, it's, this type of activity is worth rehearsing from time to time. Later that night, I had just laid down to fall asleep when the loud SAR alarm sounded in the building, launching us to recover a mountain climber high in the Washington Cascades. Now, footnote, this picture is from a rescue I did on Mount Adams, Washington a few years earlier, but as a footnote, you never see pictures or videos of the gnarliest Coast Guard rescues, because those rescues happen in the worst weather and usually are at night. No one's there to take a picture or video. So this is the best I got. We ended up hovering for this rescue next to a steep glacier and lowered the rescue litter, which is just a hoistable backboard, between ice-covered boulders, and with our tail rotor unnervingly close to spruce trees. Then orbited around the mountains in the darkness to help conserve fuel. Then picked up the climber, and we shot an instrument approach into the fog, landing at Boeing Field in Seattle with about a quarter-mile visibility and low on fuel. In a word, stressful. So if you were curious if the high altitude hover training earlier in the day helped us do the rescue, 100% yes, it did. So you may not be hovering next to mountains, but no matter what your industry, rotary wing is risky. There is so much gray area in rotary wing aviation that to fine tune one's personal go, no go limitations can make operating safer and easier. And weather is probably the easiest example, where it's ever changing and we can be surprised during a transit and inadvertently go IMC, which speaks to risk assessment. Risk assessment is a skill unto itself. Furthermore, I would say real-time risk assessment is a skill, and one worth practicing. A pilot can be proficient at a no hover landing, so too can a pilot be proficient at his or her on the fly decisions. And this is completely clear these days with the pandemic, where your average person is now operating in gray areas. Do I wash my groceries? Do I hug my mom? Not only is it a challenge to operate amongst gray area, but it's even harder when you're doing so real time. So back to aviation, maybe, flying in baddish weather with a couple minor aircraft discrepancies, you get the point. Owning this proficiency looks like practicing the mental game just as much as the kinesthetic game. Next slide, please. As such, the cohort of fellow instructor pilots in Astoria, Oregon, when I was stationed there, wrote some local pieces used in training syllabi. The handout on loss of tail rotor authority and effectiveness is just an example of such written work. The very act of thinking through a topic thoroughly enough to publicly put your knowledge out there is immensely beneficial. And this is an example of how you can lift up others while you too are getting better and smarter. So to recap, there's 4 things I'd like to just recap with you. We own our lives, so we own our training. Personal limitations are as important as all the other external limitations aviation imposes. Take inventory of personal limitations, train them, and push the edges of those limitations further and further. Third, risk assessment is a skill worth rehearsing, and real-time risk assessment is even harder. Make the fog of nuanced decisions a bit more clear before you're in the fog. And last, own your knowledge and share it. Now, I'll leave you with this. there is a lot of hardship in the world right now, more than I've ever seen. There's a whole lot of negative stuff, but I hope to impart some semblance of positive influence by recognizing you all, my fellow coasties who are about to speak, and HAI for helping with the cause. This gathering, as fleeting as it may be when we hang up and proceed on with the rest of our lives, is, in my opinion, in the camp of addressing important stuff. Whatever your industry or interests are, helicopters are an effective tool to make good in the world. By virtue of you being on this, you two are interested in making the world a better, safer, smarter place. So I thank you for that. And that's all I had to pass. Thank you for your attention, and may I please introduce Captain Chris Hulser.
Hey everybody, Chris Holzer here from Mobile, Alabama. And as Jim said, and Jim, thank you, and HAI and Chris Hill and Dan Sweet for having us in this important panel today. It's great for us to talk to, with, and for other rotary wing aviators and aircrew. So hello from Mobile. Behind me, I don't think you can see out the window, but we've got the outer bands of our Hurricane Delta coming through. So anytime that we get into the Greek alphabet, you know it's been a busy season for us down here in the Gulf of Mexico. And if you can go to the next picture, the first picture I have there is, I like to think of that as innovation and flexibility. Now, there's a lot of innovation and flexibility going on in that picture you might not see. That was taken during Hurricane Sally that came through a couple weeks ago. And in that picture, you've got an Air Station Traverse City helicopter. You've got air crews that are not necessarily all from Traverse City. They're wearing a mask because we're in the middle of a national pandemic, and they're flying in an AOR that is not familiar to them, with a hangar deck and a hangar maintenance team that is not organic to that helicopter nor that air crew. So I love this picture because it shows what we in the rotary wing community, and specifically I think in the Coast Guard aviation community, embrace, which is innovation and flexibility, and safely getting to yes where we have to. You know, I'm going to back up a little bit and tell you what I think my job is here as the commanding officer of a Coast Guard aviation unit, and that I think I'm the chief risk management officer for this 700-person unit. And I don't think my job is all that different than a chief pilot of an operating base, or a COO of a company, or commanding officer, or of any other type of military unit. We have to manage risk. And that's that equation of risk versus gain, to get to yes on the things that we must as part of the mission. And I think what's inferred there is that we have to get there safely. That's got to be inferred every time. And just like Jim said, that has got to be a conscious risk management discipline that you engage in before you make every decision. I'll tell you what, the bottom line that I like to impart with this picture is that we got to adapt, overcome, and innovate if we're going to get the rotary wing mission done. And that includes the people that I just sent off. This morning, we took off 3 H-65 helicopters here from Mobile, and they moved west out towards the storm. They're going to try and get around the west side of the storm. In about another hour, we'll take off another 2, and then a couple more after that. So all told, we've got 8 rotary wing assets. They're basically going to try and surround the storm as it comes in from the south and hits the western part of Louisiana. So we're constantly having to adapt our tactics and innovate to be able to make sure that we're mission effective. So, you know, that'll help us, that innovation will help us whether we're defeating an enemy or serving the public trust, or even just getting the edge on a corporate competitor. The other thing I want to point out this picture before we move on is just the masks. You know, the masks, I hold up my mask every time that I'm in front of a group, whether it's for ceremony, a retirement, pinning on aircrew wings. You know, we don't ever just say no, right? We say, how close to yes can we get? For the first couple of months of COVID in March, April, May, we stopped doing a lot of things. Some units stopped doing some proficiency training. Some units stopped training to places where they have to do proficiency training, like if you're traveling to a simulator or if you're traveling to a center of excellence to practice maneuvers. And, you know, every organization can hold their breath for a couple weeks, a couple months, you know, tailor that answer to your organization. But at the end of the day, once proficiency starts sliding back, you are accepting risk that you might not know, because it's that slow boil. So I would leave this slide with this, is that every organization has got to be flexible, and every organization has got to innovate. And when you innovate, you might be accepting risk and you might be buying down risk. And I'll leave you with that kind of vague comment, and maybe that'll drum up some questions. So next slide, please, Dan. So this picture is one of my favorite. It shows a special missions team doing the fast roping job that the Coast Guard does. And we also teach the DoD how to do this skill set. And to me, this is a perfect example of personal risk for enterprise gain. When you think about the risk versus gain equation, I'd say for a new pilot, you might be thinking of personal risk for personal gain, or getting that flight done. So if you're in an R-22 or a Cessna, you know, am I accepting the right risks, whether it's weather, training, proficiency, mechanical ability, environment? Am I accepting the right risks for the personal gain of getting this flight done? And then you move into the next phase, where maybe you're an operator and you have customers counting on you, or you have a mission that you have to perform to get goods from A to B. And now you say, okay, what's the risk to both the person and the industry entity that I'm part of to accomplish that mission? And maybe that mission is a profit. Maybe that mission is a service that you're providing. And then something that especially we do in the first responder, in the military side of things, is personal risk for enterprise gain. And I tell you what, that's a tough thing when you're talking to new aviators and new aircrew. And that's something that we focus in on here at ATC Mobile, is that sometimes I will ask you to take personal risks, whether it's on a flight or a mission or a week of flying, for enterprise gain. And that enterprise gain might be something like national security. It might be something like public safety, like what my crews are going out now and doing in response, or getting ready to respond to Hurricane Delta. So personal risk versus enterprise gain. And if you walk that down for the corporate gain and personal gain, those are all different levels of risk and gain that I think that we as aviation leaders have to think about. And that's not a common conversation that people have in the wardroom, or in your coffee cooler, or wherever you're doing your post-flight briefs, that type of thing. And I'd say the one word I would leave you with when I think about personal risk versus enterprise gain is culture. I think every aviation leader should ask himself, what is the culture of my organization? I hope that one of my pilots or aircrew, if they ask what the culture of ATC Mobile is that we get to yes on risk management, we get to yes on accomplishing the mission, and we get to yes on as much as we humanly can. That, hey, quite honestly, that's America. That's the Coast Guard, that's ATC Mobile, and I know that that's the culture that you want to accept in a lot of your flying programs, and doing it safely. So that's risk versus gain, especially on the enterprise level. And Dan, we can go to my final slide if you can. This might seem a little different to you. I want you to key in on the word anchors, okay? So in times of crisis, and I'll use the COVID pandemic as a crisis that we can talk about. In times of crisis, I think anchors are incredibly important. I used a picture here of a cultural anchor. When I first showed up here to Mobile, we had a lot of cultural anchors that were not happening. We weren't doing groups of people around somebody retiring, advancing, being promoted, observing colors like you see in this picture. That's not the right answer. The right answer is not to not do something that you know is important to your organization, is important to safety, is important to proficiency. The answer is yes, and how close can I get it to make the right risk versus gain equation? So in the picture you see in front of you, we have our chief's mess spread out 6 feet apart. And yeah, it took a couple extra minutes for us to all get to that real 6 foot instead of the philosophical 6 foot apart that we all want to gravitate to. And we're observing colors, just like we do on every Wednesday morning, and is culturally important to this unit. In the small picture, you see me ripping the name tags off of new students as they've just finished up their flying program to become Coast Guard aviators in the HC 144. Me pulling their name tags off is a huge cultural anchor. What that means is I pull their name tag off and we stick it in our wardroom here. And that means that every year when they come back to ATC Mobile, it is welcome home. That's a psychological safety thing for me, is that they know that they are on the team. The tryouts are over, and you are on the team. And every year when they come back and they see their name tag hanging in the wardroom, they think, okay, right, I am home. This is a safe place. This is a safe place that I can raise my hand and say, hey, something's messed up. We need to do this better. So cultural anchors are important in times of crisis. And I'll pivot that to proficiency anchors, okay? So for any chief pilots out there, or even just personal pilots, you know what your proficiency anchor points are. You know the things that you need to do, the red lines you can't cross to keep yourself or your flying program healthy. In the Coast Guard, we just went through that. Our chief pilot in the Coast Guard up at headquarters basically threw the gauntlet down, and the vice commandant did the same thing. And he said, we must resume these 2 proficiency anchor training events, which we had stopped for a little bit because of COVID considerations. And in March, April, May, that was the right thing. June, July, August, it's time to turn those things back on. We took a fix as an organization and said, yeah, you're right. Those proficiency anchors need to return. And for anybody out there not familiar with the Coast Guard, those proficiency anchors are a visit to the simulator and a visit from a standardization team out to the units. So each of those happen one time per year. So you get 2 big proficiency anchor bumps from the corporate side of the house each year. And those are things that keep us proficient. So the takeaway there is know your red lines, know what keeps you proficient. So I will stop there, and I'm going to introduce the next panelist, which is a good friend of mine, Captain Mike Campbell.
All right, well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much. Thank you, Chris Holzer and Jim Cooley, for your extremely informative discussions and very interesting twists on risk management. I'd also like to thank the HAI staff for giving us this opportunity to share a little bit about how we view and integrate the concept of risk management into Coast Guard aviation operations. It is an absolute pleasure to be here and to be speaking to all of you, and I'd like to give a shout out to all of those watching from across the globe. I understand from HAI we've got representatives, viewers from 29 different countries. So it goes to show that even though we may come from different backgrounds, we all have a common bond in our desire to manage risk, particularly when it comes to aviation. Next slide, please. So I thought I'd talk for a few minutes about how we in the Coast Guard manage risk throughout the execution of our sometimes very high risk and diverse mission areas. My particular operational background has been rotary wing throughout my flying career, but that was evenly split between our search and rescue as well as our aviation special missions. In particular, shipboard-based airborne use of force special mission set that supports our national counter-narcotics missions, primarily in the Caribbean and Eastern Pacific. As I stated earlier, all of our missions bring with them an inherent level of risk. As Capt and Holzer just mentioned, and we touched on, and Jim mentioned at the beginning of the show, as we talk on this webinar, we currently have hundreds of Coast Guard air crews surging to the Gulf Coast from all around the country to support the search and rescue operations in response to Hurricane Delta. It's just another in a long line of hurricane response operations that our crews have executed over the decades, and they are operations that are fraught with risk. So how do we manage that? Well, risk management. We use the term management as an action word, and the term implies that the action is continuous. It begins prior to pre-flight, but is a constant process. It doesn't stop. Our risk management policy states that analysis of mishap data reveals that the most common cause of mishaps is a lack of deliberate and systematic risk management during preparation, planning, and execution of operations and activities. There are a few key words that I want to hone in here that I think could benefit all those who are in the business of helicopter operations. Deliberate, systematic, and throughout the preparation, planning, and execution of operations. And I'll briefly touch on most of these with my focus more on the execution side of the house. Next slide, please. So within the Coast Guard, we have implemented a risk management policy that defines the required levels of use at all areas, and we define that as a general assessment of risk, or GAR, and that's what we refer to now as GAR 2.0 as our most recent updated version of that. Historically, that's been referred to as the green, amber, red model. GAR 2.0 is nothing more than a tool in the toolbox for operational commanders and our operational forces to use to guide discussions in the deliberate and systematic assessment of risk. GAR 2.0 also includes an evaluation and assessment of the level of gain that a particular mission might have, so that the potential risk can be weighed against the potential gain to make a good judgment decision. This deliberate and systematic approach allows operational commanders at various levels to make predetermined go or no-go decisions when they're not under pressure of executing and managing an ongoing mission. As Jim Cooley described earlier, he said, while the adrenaline is hijacking the brain. I thought that was a great quote. That quiet, deliberate analysis and decision-making when you are not in the heat of battle helps to establish sound, logical, predetermined decision-making when under the pressure, not under pressure of launching on or flying in the middle of a demanding mission. Next slide, please. Of course, we all know the conditions on scene almost never end up being as they are planned prior to the mission. The age-old military adage derived from Prussian military strategists that no plan survives first contact with the enemy is a fact of life that extends into most operational areas. Something unplanned is almost inevitable. This is why I said that risk management is an action word. It does not stop with the pre-flight planning. It is not simply a number. It's not simply a color that we use to document what we thought our risk would be prior to executing the mission. It's a continuous process that must be ongoing throughout the entire mission. Next slide, please. I like to use the famous Air Force Colonel Boyd's OODA loop to describe a method for this continuous process: observe, orient, decide, act. Throughout the mission, our crews must remain continuously vigilant in observing how the mission is progressing, what factors are changing, what conditions are not as they were expected. This is the observe. When changes do occur, and they almost always do, our crews must then orient or analyze what those changes mean to their ability to continue the mission. An unexpected aircraft system malfunction, an unfamiliar and challenging landing zone, a go-fast drug trafficking vessel that starts maneuvering aggressively, an unforecasted weather change. These are all types of changes that our crews experience in the middle of a mission that required a rapid on-scene analysis to properly orient and analyze the situation. Once oriented, we must decide how we are going to proceed. And as I mentioned earlier, the more of those decisions that we can make before the mission even starts, when we are not under the pressure of the battle, the better. As unplanned changes are encountered, stress levels rise. It is human nature. And as stress levels increase, our ability to observe, orient, decide, and act degrades. Focus narrows, our analysis is much more difficult, decision-making is hampered, and our motor skills can be affected. To combat this reduced ability to observe, orient, decide, and act when facing the unplanned, we create a series of predetermined en route decision points and actions. Next slide, please. So things like emergency procedures, landing criteria, weather minimums, airborne use of force firing azimuths and ranges, aircraft limitation exceedances. These are all predetermined decisions that help our aircrews know how to respond to changes that they encounter and reduce the amount of deciding that they have to do when they're in the heat of battle, in the middle of a case. So I like to share a little story about a case we had. I was the commanding officer of Air Station San Francisco a few years back, and we had a challenging search and rescue case where a crew was called to help a child who fell off a cliff. It was a 200-foot cliff up in the Bodega Bay area. And the helo crew went up there. The weather was horrible. It was, very windy, gusty conditions, and the ceilings were at 250 feet. So you can imagine the helo hovering at the top of the cliff only had 50 feet until they were up into the clouds. The fire department had gotten on scene first, and they were actually able to rope down to the child, who was still alive but critically injured. They were able to bring the child up the cliff, but they asked the helicopter if it could please land so that they could fly the child to the hospital quickly. So the helo crew was able to maneuver over it and land on the top of the cliff in some rugged terrain. This was at night, so it was dark, very difficult to see. And as the helo crew, the SAR crew, put the aircraft down, it was uneven terrain. It was very difficult to see, very dark conditions. As they put the aircraft down and lowered the collective and started to settle down, the aircraft took a roll and ended up settling well beyond the slope limitations of the aircraft, quite a bit beyond, pretty scary. So the fire crew was right outside the rotor arc, and they were trying to bring the child into the rotor arc to bring him into the helicopter so they can fly the child to the hospital. And that crew had to make the on-scene decision right then and there. Do we continue with this mission, or do we abide by our published slope limitations and my knowledge of the aircraft and not continue with this mission? And they had to make, probably arguably in my career, one of the most difficult decisions I'd ever seen made. And they made the decision not to go. And I thought that decision was the right decision. That aircraft was well beyond its published limitations, and they could not assuredly take off without potentially crashing and right there on deck, which would have just made that condition much worse. So they had to find alternate means to get that child to the hospital, which they did, and the child did survive. So that story did end well, but I thought that was a great example of making on-scene risk-based decisions in the heat of battle. And it doesn't get any more in the heat of battle in the search and rescue world than to have a child who needs immediate medical assistance. Next slide, please. So where I sit now as the Chief of Responsive Operations for an entire district, I still value and depend greatly upon our risk management process within the Coast Guard, and I'm intimately involved in risk management of our ongoing operations, just in a different way than I was when I was performing the mission myself, or even as an on-scene operational commander. Senior executives from any business involved with helicopter operations must embrace a deliberate and systematic assessment of risk, and they must lead from the top in this regard. Some might think that they should not be involved with attempting to micromanage their operators, but I could not disagree more. Sure, your technical experts should drive the technical aspects of your risk analysis to help you make as many predetermined go and no-go decision points as possible. But senior level engagement in the risk management process demonstrates a commitment to risk management across the organization. If senior leadership is not actively engaged, operators are not going to make it a priority, and that will undoubtedly result in mishaps. As Chris Holzer stated so perfectly earlier, he views his job as being the Chief Risk Management Officer. Leadership starts at the top. Risk management starts at the top. So I'd like to finish up, and I'd like to invite back our first two guests, Captain Chris Holzer and Jim Cooley, along with Mr. Chris Hill, so we can open up the discussion to some questions and answers.
All right. Well, that was just awesome, gentlemen. Thank you very much. Just very briefly, just truth in advertising. I've had the honor of serving with each of these gentlemen in my past life, and I'm honored to call them friend as well. So hopefully by the end of this Q&A, they'll still be able to consider us friends, but we'll just dive right into it. So thank you again. Jim Cooley and Chris Holzer, you each provided some handouts in advance of this session, and we've had several late arrivals today. So I'm just going to one more reminder to those joining late that you can go into the panel off to the side, look for the tab that says handouts, and feel free to download those very informative handouts that supplement their presentations today. You'll find them very useful. Also, for those who are curious, we will be providing a recording of this event that should be available sometime tomorrow. So if you missed out on a piece or you want to be able to watch another component of it, it'll be right there for your viewing. All right, so we've got a few questions that have already popped into the thing. Lots of interest here. But first thing I think I'd like to touch on here is acknowledging the fact that the Coast Guard has outstanding resources. Let's just face it. You know, you have the benefit of the U.S. taxpayer to keep you in business and keep you sharp and proficient, and that is something that not all commercial operators have the luxury of doing. So our first question is very, very well structured, and it's almost dead on with the question I had prepped. So I'll just give Javid Bashir. He asked, every organization doesn't have enough resources to provide training hours to undergo hazardous situations. Can those organizations overcome this by utilizing simulator training? So I'll push this over to you, Chris, as the manager of the Coast Guard's entire aviation training and the Coast Guard's flight simulators you have arrayed around the country. What advice can you offer to Javid, and how can simulation help overcome some of the resource challenges the commercial world faces?
Yeah, you bet, Chris. And hey, Javid, that's a great question. Thank you, because your question is very in line or aligned with what industry is thinking right now, what the military is thinking right now, is that what is the best way to get to our end goal or end product of a proficient, current and proficient pilot, and who is, you know, perpetually proficient, right? So how many trips to the simulator, that type of thing. In the Coast Guard, we're currently looking, and just so you know, I have 17 aircraft here at ATC Mobile. We fly about 3,000 flights a year, and I have 12 simulators. Those 12 simulators are simulators that all Coast Guard aircrew cycle through here each year to use. And the question we ask ourselves is, what can be done best in the simulator and what can be done best in the aircraft? But then the second question is, what risk can we accept to do it in the simulator, even though it's better done in the aircraft? And that's the art, not the science, because you get a lot of people who say they're purists and they're like, you can't simulate that in the simulator. And no matter how good our simulators get, maybe in a generation or two they will be, but no matter how good they get, they're not going to be perfect, right? Maybe in the back of the mind, you know you're in a simulator. Maybe just this one thing is just a little off. But the point is, I say you have to constantly ask yourself what the balance is of, one, what can you afford? Two, what do you have access to? And then three, where are you willing to accept risk of doing something in the simulator or not doing something in the simulator? And a lot of times, I would say for industry, what a lot of times people end up doing is they say that the choice is doing something in a simulator or not at all. And I know that none of these things are inexpensive. And in the military, we do sometimes have the luxury of access to these systems, or regular access to these systems. So I don't know that I answered the question perfectly there, Javid. What I would say though is that it's an equation that we're constantly playing with, and we are moving a lot more of our training into the simulator. And in fact, the HC-144 twin engine airplane simulator, we're doing about 80% of our training in the simulator, whereas 25 years ago, that would have been flipped on its head. It would have been 20% in the simulator.
All right, thanks. I think you answered it really well for Javid. Thanks a lot, Chris. And just as a point of note, you know, the Coast Guard, because of the hazardous types of missions they do, they expend probably right around 50% of their flight time just on training hours. If that number is plus or minus 10% there, Chris, about right?
No, you're exactly right. In fact, 50% is usually the floor. I would bet that Mike in Hitron was well up above 50% because of the dangerous nature of their mission and the special nature of that mission. Mike, if you want to comment on that.
I agree with that. We do, you know, you could say that we have the advantage of that, and that's a true statement. We do have the resource hours to be able to invest maybe more time. But I also say that it is an investment decision. And, you know, this is probably speaking more to, you know, corporate leadership. Investing in training of your personnel of your operators is a worthwhile investment, and you have to balance that. Is that extra training is going to buy down your risk of potential mishaps and the cost of those mishaps, both in lives as well as in assets and in property. So, that's a decision that is always challenging, and is never an easy decision, and there's no perfect number, to figure out where that number, where that balance is. But it is something that even in government, it's a conscious decision of balancing how much time we can invest in training versus getting the mission done.
Yeah, and real quickly there, Mike Campbell, who just came on board, his most recent operational command was at the Helicopter Interdiction Tactical Squadron, and the acronym for that is HITRON. Because you're watching military folks on a webinar, you'll be barraged with acronyms that sometimes we'll have to catch up and get you guys on board with what they're saying. So yeah, I had the pleasure of working with Mike down there at HITRON. And Mike, just a real quick question about that. So the Coast Guard did a long progression of undertaking the Airborne Use of Force counter-drug mission and other Airborne Use of Force missions. The Coast Guard didn't take that new mission set lightly, and that they certainly had a larger organizational risk assessment. Can you just briefly describe that evolution into that world?
Yeah, so it started about 20 years ago, and it started with, we talk about risk versus gain, and we had a mission set to counter the drug flow into the United States, which was overcoming our surface assets. And we had no means to be able to stop these vessels, these go-fast vessels that were outrunning our boats. And we determined that we needed a new capability. So we went about and tried to create a way to use aircraft, force from aircraft to compel these vessels to stop. And we developed the Airborne Use of Force program with precision marksmen. And for those who don't know, the mission set is to stop the vessels. We're not shooting any people. We're not trying to create any harm with anybody. Anything, we take great means to minimize and avoid any kind of injury to any personnel on the vessel. Our job is to stop the vessel to enable us to conduct the law enforcement boarding and to stop that drug flow. So how do you do that? As I mentioned earlier, that systematic and deliberate process. There was a lot of table talking. There was a lot of discussion. There was a lot of bringing together great minds to figure out how can we do this? How can we do this safely, but still be effective at this mission set? Developed tactics, tactical procedures, and then got aircraft and started outfitting the aircraft. Did a lot of test and evaluation work, baby steps, working up into it, and then set limits. We set limits. How can we do this, but we can still do it effectively? We set limitations on our altitudes, on our ranges, on our azimuths for taking shots, so that we could do that safely. And that's a continuous process throughout the years. We refine that to make sure that we can do it effectively and safely. So, and we've been very successful at that. So that's a good example.
All right, excellent. Thanks, Mike. Yeah, so for the message for the commercial operators out there, something you hear quite often, if you're getting a new type mission, a new type aircraft, new folks coming on board, don't rest on your laurels and stick to what you've done in the past. You're constantly reassessing what you do, the people who are doing it, and how you're doing it, and what you're doing it with. New systems, everything, it's all on the table, and be re-looking at your risk every time you take on something new. So certainly taking on a whole new counter-drug missions at the higher scale. Jim Cooley, we've got some folks who are, probably watching on here who might be interested in finding out what's it take to become a Coast Guard pilot, and what about coming on board and joining the Coast Guard these days? What's the barriers to entry for those folks?
Well, yeah, no, I appreciate the interest to whomever was reaching out to Chris Hill. That is fantastic. So there's a couple different avenues. Of course, us four are aviators, and so we can speak most intelligently about that. But yeah, there's a couple different ways. There's if you're, depending on how old you are, you can. All our pilots are officers, so that's kind of step one. And then applying to getting into and finishing flight school would be the step two. Now, a different angle is for those, and I know that there are some military members on this call from your registration, if you are interested, there's a path there too. We call them direct commission aviators. And then also, I mean, experience, you can be, if you have a college degree, you could then become an officer. And if you have flight experience, that would only help with trying to get into aviation. So that's kind of the overview.
All right. Yeah. Thanks, Jim. So how's the pipeline right now? Is the Coast Guard accepting applications for direct commission or OCS right now?
Absolutely. Yeah, we always are. And you know, 6 months ago, we were really hurting. You know, I mean, the airlines were going gangbusters. A lot of our fixed wing aviators specifically had a very easy off ramp to the airlines. And you know what? In the military, I don't discourage that from my folks. You know, we have you know, we have a lot of people that join the Coast Guard because they, first of all, they want to serve their nation. 2, they want to be in the military, and 3, they want to fly. And then we have contract and time commitments set up so that we get what we need and they get what they need. And you know, I never want to like stop training our people well because they'll go fly for somebody else. That's how everybody loses. So we are still taking applications. And just like Jim said, you know, really, if you're in your 20s, put your application in. We would love to have you in the Coast Guard. There's 6 ways to Sunday to end up being a pilot in the Coast Guard, whether you enlist, become an officer, join another service, and then off ramp into the Coast Guard. There's just many different ways.
Awesome. Thanks a lot. Well, hey, we've got an international guest tuning in today, Benito Palma from Spain. And I'm going to direct this one to you, Mike, because you've probably seen more sporty missions combined than all these guys. Which is the most important aspect of a crew to handle in a risky operation? So just interpret the question however you like and see if you can, you know, give Benito an answer there.
So which is the, can you repeat the first part? Which is the
most important aspect of a crew to handle a risky operation? So I guess what Benito's trying to say, what's the most important thing to focus on when you're dealing with a risky operation?
I think a common picture is if you're working as a crew, and in the helicopter world, we work as a crew. It's not not like an Air Force or a fighter jet where, you know, as one person in the aircraft, they're working as a team with their other aircraft. But in a helicopter, you typically have multiple people in that aircraft, and you all are operating as a team. And you know, we exercise and train a lot with crew resource management. And try to make sure that we all share, we use the term sharing the mental model, and make sure that we all have the same picture of where we are. We have the same idea of situational awareness, where we are in space and time, what the conditions are around us, what the mission is that we're attempting to do, and then in a joint way discussing and understanding and having a shared mental understanding of what the risks that we're facing in that particular moment. I think a lot of mishaps go off the rail, or a lot of incidents, you know, a lot of operations can go off the rail when people in the same aircraft aren't on the same page. And you know, in the Coast Guard, we do a lot of you know, hoisting, and that's a very coordinated effort between the 2 pilots in the front, the flight mech, the rescue swimmer on the hook. Or in the Airborne Use of Force world, same thing, 2 pilots up front, precision marksman in the back, conning the aircraft into position. You know, that team needs to be very synced, and they need to have a common picture of where they are, what they're doing, what their risks are, so that they can you know, talk through that and get through that together.
All right, great, thanks, Mike. So Jim, I'm going to take a piece of your message of own it all, and then I'm going to weave that into a question that direct it to Chris. So it's kind of like a convoluted thing here. So we got Chris Young, actually a former Navy guy. We'll excuse him. He actually did get a DCA offer letter and turned it down and joined the Navy for who knows why. He's a member of the HAI Safety Working Group, good contributor to the safety dialogue every week. He cracked open one of those handouts of yours, Chris, the ATC Mobile policy, making safety at the level of execution requires it to be personal. How do you have your members make it personal? What's the message you're trying to say there?
Sure. Well, and I would go back to when I talked about culture. And I would weave that into owning it, like Jim says. I can't have my two watchwords are mission and family. And, you know, we all exist here in the military to do the mission. And you can't do the mission unless you're part of healthy family circles, whether it's your faith family, your family at home family, your aircrew family, your hangar deck family, whatever family circle that is. And if you don't personally feel accountable to owning safety as a value, and that doesn't mean just flying in the plane. That means coming in and out to work every day. That means your hygiene right now in the COVID crisis. All of these things are personal. Especially when you're part of a military aircrew. You know, we all say, hey, there's my work stuff and my personal life. There is very few walls in between those things. If you are not personally owning safety as a value in your whole life, you're putting the crew and the mission at risk.
All right, great, thanks, Chris. Jim, you've been on the sidelines. Apologies for that. You know, just the way it worked out. So I've got a good risk management question for you and standardization. So this is your bailiwick. You're the Aviation Safety Training Manager at Coast Guard Headquarters. And Rick Newsom asked us, how do you implement standardization to ensure Coast Guard risk management principles are adopted across all the crews and all the bases?
All right, Rick, great question. Well, the easy answer is we are a branch in the military. So, but obviously, besides telling people to do things, that's the bee's knees. And so, there's a couple of different things that the Coast Guard does. One is we do indeed have safety standardization visits. This is kind of in the weeds, but just since you asked, I'll give you a flavor. There's an annual, there's kind of two annual assessments. One is a self-assessment, and then every 3 years, people at headquarters show up and do a qualitative assessment, interviews and observations to just get a feel for, like, okay, this is what they're doing in Corpus Christi, Texas, and this is what they're doing in Traverse City, Michigan, and oh, hey, Kodiak, Alaska, we saw this awesome thing. So we kind of amalgamate all the different, units throughout the continent to be on the same page. The other thing is it's easy with a smaller organization, and that's the easiest comparison is the sister services. We're considerably smaller. So I happen to know every single flight safety officer in the Coast Guard on a first name basis, just because there aren't all that many. So we can do things like town halls and kind of obvious-ish promotional events that where we can underscore certain points. Say we notice, I don't know, deficiency seems like a harsh word, but you get what I'm saying. Like some sort of thing that we want to address and get everyone up to speed, up to snuff on. Then we can just do that, and everyone's kind of available to partake. And then the last thing I'll say is hearkening back to what Captain Chris Hulser said is culture. We have an easy audience. In aviation in general, as compared to other high reliability organizations, there's a lot of buy-in for safety. So there's that. And then furthermore, as we're narrowing down on the subsets of people, like the Coast Guard is a small microcosm, aviation is a small microcosm, and furthermore, aviation within Coast Guard is even smaller. So we can kind of control and navigate and course correct our culture quite easily. But frankly, like I said, it's an easy audience. We're already bought in. The train's moving down the tracks.
All right, great, Jim. All right, so we are approaching the top of the hour. We do advertise this as a 1-hour webinar, but if there's lots of good questions coming in, and there are, we offer people an opportunity to stick around and continue with the Q&A, and we've pre-arranged that with you gentlemen. Has that changed for you? You ready to stick around and hit a few more questions? All right, we certainly understand those of you who are viewing. If you have to beg off, just remember this, the full recording will be available tomorrow if you're not able to see the ending half. We'll stick around here another 10 minutes or so and see if we can get through a couple more questions. All right, so I'd like to shift to fatigue and fatigue management. And how perfect of a time to talk about that, as we've got Hurricane Delta raging up right toward your neck of the woods, Chris, and you've got quite a few crews there. You've got several operations officers answering the phones all across the country. How do you manage the crew fatigue, and when you know you're going to bag a crew, and you can describe what that means, what's your process for managing the risk as it relates to fatigue when you have all-night missions going on for multiple crews?
Sure. So I'm going to pull in a couple things that Mike said, that Jim said, and some of my own thoughts. So one is, I like to refer to the triad of proficiency, which is the corporate, the unit, and the member. Okay, and I kind of use generic words there. So in the corporation of the Coast Guard has rules, and those rules are fairly strict, and there's red lines. You shall not fly longer than this. You shall not stand this many days of duty in a row, things like that. Those are your baseline, right? Then you have a unit where the intimacy is supposed to be much greater. The unit, the operations officer, the chief pilot, myself, we should be getting in touch and injecting this culture in our crews of only accepting the missions that they feel like they can feasibly do without hurting themselves. Like Mike said in Hitchron, the goal is to never hurt somebody else, much less our own crews, right? So that takes that reporting culture of being able to raise my hand. Ask yourself as an aviation leader, does your air crew feel that they can raise their hand and say, hey boss, I can't take that mission. I know it doesn't seem like on paper that I've been up for that long, or I haven't flown that many hours, but I can't do this one. Do you have a culture that allows that? And the other one is, if it's got to get done, right? I have been over the Everglades off of Miami at 3 a.m, where the aircraft is really quiet, and you look around and you realize you're the only person awake, and it's probably only been for 45 seconds, but I guarantee you every other military pilot, every other civil pilot has been in a situation like that where they've done the head nod, and the head nod, and something that we talk about is shared awareness, and Mike talked a lot about that. Is the whole crew, did you confess to the crew, hey guys, hey, somebody needs to say something every minute, okay, so that we can get through this, because the mission has got to get done. But if you're that far down the road, then it needs to be worth it, and you need to have made a conscious decision, and then you need to be mitigating. So that's kind of just some personal thoughts there.
All right. Thanks for that, Chris. And I'd say for our commercial folks on the line, there might not be a whole lot of missions out there that, if you catch yourself nodding off, that you would want to continue. But, just a quick little, public service announcement. We got some folks who have to hang it out there doing a little higher risk mission. So just acknowledging that. Just shout out to David Bashir again for that good question. And then Jim Diamenti, former Marine pilot, flew frogs. Both of them had questions on fatigue risk management. So thank you for that.
Frogs forever.
Yeah. Next question. Let's shift gears. We're not talking rotary necessarily. We're talking unmanned drones. So Mike Campbell, you're the director, you're the chief of response for one of the Coast Guard's largest districts, and you've got cutters underway all the time. And I believe there's some new capabilities being employed out there in the area of unmanned. Why don't you tell us what's going on?
Sure. So we're using unmanned aerial systems in a variety of ways. We've got systems installed on our larger cutters, our high endurance national security cutters that are used. They're great capability add. They can fly for an extended period of time and provide persistent presence, as well as detect monitoring capability from the ships, which is huge. And that we can reserve the helicopters to just pounce and respond once a target's identified. So extremely helpful in that regard. But then we also have some other with some smaller UAS unmanned aerial systems being used right now. Being prototyped and tested around the Coast Guard at the sectors, at the small boat stations, on ATON, aids to navigation units. Really, we're kind of just scratching at the surface of what this capability, what this technology can provide us as a service. I think anybody who is in the aviation line of business, all of us, if we're not wise enough to be able to see down the road and realize that the days of, you know, only manned aircraft are going down and diminishing in the future. I mean, that is the way of the future. You want to talk about reducing risk to the people that are doing these missions. If we don't have to put them in the aircraft, that obviously reduces a lot of risk in that regard. Obviously, there's a ways to go before we get there, but I see unmanned aerial systems being involved in all of our mission sets. We don't know what we don't know right now about how we can implement these type of systems. But search and rescue, you know, the days of you know, flying out. I can remember when you well remember it, Chris. You know, the days of Coast Guard flying search and rescue cases in a helicopter, you know, 50 miles offshore in the dark at night before we were wearing night vision goggles, flying search patterns, looking for a person in the water. I mean, that was almost futile. Well, now, you know, that in the future, that may be a drone with sensor systems on it that's doing all the searching. And then once they find something, then here comes the helicopter crew or the boat crew to come rescue you. So I think UAS, we're embracing it, and it is definitely it's definitely going to become more prominent in Coast Guard aviation, Coast Guard's future.
All right, excellent. That question came from Rick Newman, a return customer to these webinars. Thank you for that. And he was curious about the SAR angle, so it looks like we're going to be moving in that direction. Gosh, we've got a ton of questions that have come in, and we've probably going to be about answering a couple more questions here. Apologies to all of you, we're not getting to all of the questions. I'm going to show a little favoritism to the former safety director at HAI, Jay Heffernan. Welcome back again, a longtime viewer. He finds it interesting that you all commented on leading risk management. Can you describe how tough that transition was to get the force, you know, to adopt that mindset? It seems like there's lots of opportunity to step on toes. How can the commercial side learn a lesson from your path in the risk management world to maybe find a nuanced way to implement risk management in their operation? Want to take a shot at that, Chris?
Sure. Here's the battle that I think we've had in the Coast Guard, and maybe that can help parallel to the industry, is that it's romantic to say things like we have to go out but we don't have to come back, right? Really, that's silly, because a mentality like that means you can't go out the next day because you didn't come back, and that's a waste of America's treasure. That's a bad thing. It's a waste of corporate treasure. So but it's still romantic nonetheless. I mean, we still see movies with that all the time. So I'm going to go back to my word culture again. You know, the culture, I hope, I pray, the culture here at ATC Mobile is that we accept warranted risk, right? It's a word that we don't stray from in the Coast Guard. Is we accept warranted risk to get the mission done, and we only accept the risk necessary to get it done and safely return. I hope that my folks have fallen in love with that concept, because I remind them that it's invest to save. It's their families they're going back to at night, and then the next day they get to go rescue more families and bring them home. So personal safety is huge, and making them confront the trade-off every day is huge. And yeah, you got to battle a little narrative.
Yeah. Well, thanks for that. I appreciate it. You wanted to chime in on that, Mike?
Chime in, because I want to. This actually touches on something that Jim said earlier, and you know, Capt Alberty nailing and talking about culture. But I want to emphasize for the corporate world, you know, Jim might have made it sound a little bit easier than it really is. You know, yes, we're a military service, and in an ideal world, I tell you all, implement risk management and be safe, and you're supposed to do that. And of course, aye, sir, and do it. But that's not the reality. The reality is, as we've stated, is we have a fantastic safety culture in Coast Guard aviation. That did not just poof out of thin air overnight because we wrote some great policies and published them out to the fleet. That was built on the backs of the heroes that have gone before us, the leaders who have gone before us. You know, the Admiral Couriers of the world, the people, the folks from our historical background that have evolved over the years and have grown our organization to become more safety conscious, to become more, become better experts at risk management and balancing the high risk missions that we do against the safety of our air crews. And that doesn't happen overnight, but it does start from the top. And senior leaders have to engage in that discussion and have to demonstrate their commitment to risk management and to that safety culture in order for it to permeate through the rest of the organization. If they don't lead from the top, it's not going to happen.
Awesome. All right. Well, we're 10 after right now. I'm gonna ask one question and then I'll follow up with a closeout question. So Juan Morales Cortez, he's asking, how can a civilian piston pilot with 2,900 and 992 hours volunteer in an aviation unit in the Coast Guard? So I think what he's referring to is, does the Coast Guard have a active auxiliary program, and particularly, are there any that support use of helicopters? Anything you can share there? Any one of you just grab that one.
So I'll jump on that. I have had a lot of experience with the Coast Guard Auxiliary. So if I would tell Mr. Cortez to just Google U.S. Coast Guard Air Auxiliary, and the first thing that comes up is the support arm of the U.S. Coast Guard, and it's tens of thousands of people, a little bit less so in the aviation world. But what that does is we can actually give you a small stipend to fly your aircraft after you've been, certified as an auxiliarist and proven safe and all that stuff. But it's a relatively short process, and we love our auxiliarists because they do missions, actual Coast Guard missions for us, that then we don't have to have our Coast Guard aircraft and air crews flying on. So it's a job share almost, and we have 13 aircraft here at ATC Mobile that do Coast Guard auxiliary missions for us, and helicopters are eligible as far as I know. But I would just Google that, and you're going to get all the information you want there.
Indeed,
Awesome.
The helicopters are available. They're few and far between just because of the immense cost. But man, let me just double down on that the actual bona fide missions, where for instance is we talked about bagging a crew before, where there may be a helicopter crew doing search and they're approaching a bag limit, but there may be a reason why we don't want to breach that bag limit. Boom, swap out, hand off with the auxiliary. They may fly for a couple hours, or maybe first flight in the morning, and then active duty comes in. So thanks for your interest. The auxiliary is immensely helpful.
Awesome. Well, I don't know if we identified bag limit. So when somebody's flown their allotted time or been on duty for their allotted time, they turn into the proverbial pumpkin, and we have to find somebody else to step into their shoes. So thank you for that. Very briefly, gentlemen, Jim, we can just go in sequence that you presented. One key takeaway you want your audience to remember today, if there's only one thing they remember, what do you want them to remember from this risk management webinar?
Yeah, it's just honestly, it's a variation on the premise of extreme ownership. Is just taking inventory of one's own risk that they're willing to accept, what their own proficiency is, and then and owning everything that they possibly can, to include training.
Awesome.
And I would offer, I'm gonna go back to my go-to word of culture, is you can purchase pilots, you can purchase flight hours, but what you can't purchase is a culture. The culture is something that you as a leader, and I'm talking to our aviation leaders, the culture you create in your organization is going to be, it's going to produce the right effects. It's going to produce the people that are going to make the right risk decisions. And that's what I see here at the Coast Guard units that I've been at, is a good, healthy, safe culture.
And I'll piggyback on that, and just drive home the points I made about having a safe risk management program that is deliberate and systematic, but most importantly is led from the top. And as Chris said, it's not only the policies and the procedures, instituting those in your organization, but it's living that on a day-to-day basis and demonstrating that commitment to risk management is what goes a long way to build that culture.
Awesome. Gentlemen, thank you so much. I'm honored to have been on the screen with you today. I hope we can do it in person next time. I'm going to ask Dan to come on the screen with me. I will bid you goodbye. Best of luck with the hurricane and all of your missions moving forward. Take care, gentlemen.
See you, Chris.
Be well, Chris.
I will add my gratitude to Chris's thanks. As somebody who grew up along the Oregon coast and has seen the Coast Guard fly in horrendous weather, I deeply appreciate what you guys have done, not only today, but with your careers and for the nation. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dan.
Please enjoy your day. I invite you to go ahead and turn your cameras off. I'll do some housekeeping. Coming up next, we have webinars every week. Next week, we have improving diversity and inclusion in our industry. It's a topic that I believe will be a very stimulating topic. On October 22nd, we anticipate speaking with members of the California Army National Guard firefighting team that rescued the people from a couple of fires about a month ago. They will also discuss just the firefighting season in general. It continues out there. We're hoping that they'll be able to join us, but fire season does continue and we'll see what happens. Long range, we want to make sure that you know December 10th, we will have FAA Administrator Steve Dixon on to discuss aviation matters with Jim Viola. That's probably one you don't want to miss. All of our webinars are at 4 p.m. Eastern Time every week, every Thursday afternoon. Just watch for the link in email, on social media, and in Rotor Daily. For those who you had registered, we do have a questionnaire that we'll be following shortly. We do ask that you take just a few minutes to follow through and answer our questions. One of the questions we ask is what you'd like to see us do a webinar on. That's been very helpful in trying to prepare our schedule long range. So we do please ask that you take a few minutes and answer that. Regarding HAI in general, we'd love to know what you think, what we could do better, what we're doing great, where we could improve. And easiest way to do that is to send Jim Viola an email at president@rotor.org. He sees every email that comes in. He does assign those emails to our staff members for tasking. So we do, again, ask for your input. Until next week, we ask that you be safe, that you fly safe, and we look forward to seeing you next week.